I'm Commander Casey Cliff, 32, and I built my career in the armed forces, leading missions most people only hear about in classified briefings. For years, I sent money home, showed up at every family gathering, and kept supporting parents who rarely gave anything back. But at my cousin's wedding, when my own father introduced me as the unemployed failure who never made something of herself, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or undervalued by someone you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being disrespected, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I learned early that my father measured worth in numbers, bank balances, square footage, business deals closed. Growing up in our suburban house with its manicured lawn and three-car garage, I understood that appearances mattered more than anything else. Dad built his reputation in our community one handshake at a time, one charitable donation at a time, one carefully curated story at a time. He was the kind of man who could work a room, remembering names and asking about people's children with practiced precision. At the country club, he held court at the 19th hole, spinning tales of his latest business ventures while other men nodded appreciatively. Success, to him, was quantifiable and visible. It had to be something others could see, touch, and envy. I spent my childhood trying to earn a place in that world of his approval. Honor roll every semester, captain of the debate team, valedictorian of my graduating class, I collected achievements like trophies, hoping each one would finally make him look at me the way he looked at his quarterly earnings reports. When report cards came home, I'd present them with nervous anticipation, watching his face for some flicker of genuine pride. "Good job, kiddo," he'd say, glancing at the straight A's before folding the paper and setting it aside. "Keep it up." Then he'd turn back to his newspaper or his phone calls, already moving on to more important matters. My brother Michael, 3 years older and infinitely less concerned with academic excellence, could make Dad beam simply by landing a part-time job at the local auto parts store. Dad would call his golf buddies to announce that Mike was learning the value of hard work and starting from the ground up like his old man. When Mike got promoted to assistant manager after 2 years, Dad threw him a celebration dinner at the steakhouse downtown, inviting half the neighborhood to toast his son's success. I'd won the state debate championship that same month. Dad mentioned it to exactly no one. The pattern became clearer as I grew older. When the family faced a financial rough patch during my sophomore year of college, Dad's construction business hit by a recession. I worked double shifts at 3 different jobs to send money home. I covered mortgage payments, utility bills, even groceries. For 8 months, I kept our family afloat while Dad scrambled to find new contracts. When he finally landed a major project and got back on his feet, there was no acknowledgement of my contribution. Instead, he told people how he'd weathered the storm and pulled through by his own determination. The silence around my sacrifices stung more than any criticism could have. I chose the military not as an act of rebellion, but as an escape into a world where merit actually mattered. At 18, I walked into the recruiter's office seeking something I'd never found at home, a place where my efforts would be seen, measured, and valued. The structure appealed to me, the clear hierarchy, the way advancement came through proven capability rather than politics or posturing. Basic training was brutal, but it was also revelation. For the first time in my life, I was judged solely on performance. Could I complete the obstacle course? Could I lead a squad through a tactical exercise? Could I make the hard decisions under pressure? The answers were measurable, observable, and fair. When I excelled, my superiors noticed. When I struggled, they helped me improve. It was everything my relationship with Dad had never been. The years that followed brought deployments, promotions, and responsibilities I could never have imagined at 18. I led teams through operations that required split-second decisions and unwavering composure. I earned the respect of soldiers who'd initially seen me as just another college kid playing soldier. I saved lives, completed missions, and slowly climbed the ranks through a combination of competence and dedication. Through it all, I maintained my connection to family. During leave, I'd drive home to attend birthday parties, anniversaries, and holiday gatherings. I sent money when emergencies arose, and they always seemed to arise. When Mom needed surgery, I covered the deductible. When the roof leaked, I paid for repairs. When Michael's wedding required more financing than Dad could manage, I quietly transferred the funds without being asked. At family dinners, exhausted from deployments and jet-lagged from international assignments, I'd sit at the familiar kitchen table and listen to Dad hold court. He'd tell stories about his business deals, his golf game, his latest networking triumph. When anyone asked about my career, he'd wave a dismissive hand and change the subject. "She's doing fine," he'd say. "Still figuring things out." The dismissal became routine, expected. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd found validation elsewhere, that Dad's approval was no longer necessary for my self-worth. But late at night, alone in base housing or temporary quarters overseas, I'd sometimes wonder what it would take to earn even a moment of genuine recognition from the man who'd shaped my earliest understanding of success. I never imagined the answer would come wrapped in humiliation at a family wedding, delivered by a stranger who understood my worth better than my own father ever had. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of seeking his approval, I'd finally get his attention through the one thing he understood best: public embarrassment. Looking back now, I realize those years of quiet perseverance and ignored achievements were preparing me for something I couldn't yet see. Every overlooked accomplishment, every minimized success, every time I chose dignity over confrontation, it was all building toward a moment when the truth would speak louder than any words I could have chosen. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we do, but from what we no longer need to prove. The warning signs crept in slowly, like water finding hairline cracks in a foundation. As my career advanced and my responsibilities grew, Dad's introductions at family events became increasingly vague. Where he once might have mentioned my job at all, even dismissively, now he simply said, "This is my daughter," and moved on to more interesting topics. At my cousin Amy's graduation party, I overheard him talking to his business partner, Jim, about the challenges of raising children. "You do your best," he said, shaking his head with practiced weariness, "but sometimes they just need more time to find their way." My daughter's still figuring things out. I was 32 years old, leading a team of 45 people through operations that required security clearances Jim couldn't even spell. The subtle erosion of respect accelerated during family dinners. Dad had always been the storyteller, the center of attention, but now his narratives began rewriting history with surgical precision. The financial help I'd provided during the recession became temporary assistance from family. My years of covering emergencies transformed into everyone pitching in when needed. Most tellingly, my discipline and work ethic, qualities he'd never acknowledged, suddenly became lessons he'd taught me. I always told her the importance of structure, he'd say to relatives who nodded politely. "That's where she gets her organizational skills." I'd sit there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching him claim credit for characteristics he'd never noticed, let alone nurtured. The brazenness of it should have been shocking, but it felt almost inevitable, a natural progression of years of minimizing my actual achievements. His business partner circle reinforced these tendencies. Jim and his associates were men who measured success in luxury cars and vacation homes, who competed over golf club memberships and wine collections. In their world, image was everything, and substance was whatever looked good at the country club. Dad fit seamlessly into this environment, playing the role of successful patriarch surrounded by dependents rather than equals. The shift became more pronounced at family gatherings, where once he might have given me perfunctory credit for academic or professional achievements, now he actively avoided mentioning my career at all. When relatives asked what I was doing, he'd change the subject or make vague comments about my keeping busy. It was as if my entire professional life existed in a parallel universe, visible to everyone except him. During one particularly memorable Thanksgiving dinner, my aunt asked directly about my work. Before I could answer, Dad jumped in with, "She's doing government work, nothing too exciting." Government work. as if I were processing passport applications instead of coordinating multinational security operations. My aunt's confused expression suggested she sensed something was off, but she let it pass. The most revealing moment came during a conversation about my brother's promotion to regional sales manager at his company. Dad spent 20 minutes detailing Michael's responsibilities, salary increase, and future prospects. When the conversation naturally turned to my recent advancement, I'd been selected for a position that required Senate confirmation. Dad suddenly remembered urgent phone calls he needed to make. "Excuse me," he said, already standing. "Business never sleeps." I realized then that my success had become inconvenient to his narrative. In his carefully constructed world, I was supposed to remain the daughter who needed guidance, who validated his wisdom through my dependence on his advice. My independence threatened that story, my competence contradicted it, and my achievements rendered it obsolete. But rather than adjusting his worldview to accommodate reality, he'd chosen to simply ignore the parts that didn't fit. It was easier to pretend I was still figuring things out than to acknowledge I'd figured things out just fine without him. The psychological mechanism was almost elegant in its simplicity. By diminishing my accomplishments, he maintained his position as the family's primary source of wisdom and success. By keeping me small in his stories, he kept himself large. My victories became threats to his identity rather than reasons for pride. I began to understand that this wasn't about me at all. It was about his need to remain the central figure in every narrative, the patriarch whose guidance shaped his children's destinies. My career had grown beyond his ability to influence or even understand, which made it dangerous to his self-image. The irony was that I'd spent years trying to earn his approval by becoming exactly what he claimed to value: successful, responsible, independent. But those qualities, once achieved, threatened the very dynamic that had defined our relationship. He needed me to need him, to validate his importance through my dependence. What I couldn't have predicted was how completely this psychological arrangement would collapse when exposed to someone who actually understood the nature of my work. All it would take was one person who knew the difference between government work and commanding operations that shaped international security. One person who understood that titles and clearances aren't given lightly, that responsibility at my level isn't stumbled into by accident. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Elegant script announcing my cousin Jennifer's marriage to a man I'd never met. Jennifer and I had grown up together, sharing summers at our grandmother's house and maintaining a steady correspondence through college and beyond. Despite the growing distance between Dad and me, family traditions still mattered. Weddings, funerals, milestone birthdays, these were the occasions that brought us together, neutral ground where old grievances could be temporarily set aside. I requested leave and drove the 600 miles home, my dress blues carefully pressed and hanging in the back seat. The decision to wear my uniform wasn't calculated. I simply hadn't packed civilian clothes formal enough for a wedding. It seemed practical, respectful even. Military personnel wore dress uniforms to weddings all the time. The country club where the reception was held buzzed with familiar faces and practiced small talk. I moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations for Jennifer, making polite conversation with relatives I saw twice a year. The usual questions came up. Where was I stationed? How long would I be in town? Was I seeing anyone? And I answered with the same comfortable deflections I'd perfected over the years. Dad worked his usual magic, moving between groups with practiced ease, his laugh carrying across the room as he shared stories and observations. I watched him from across the dance floor, noting how naturally he commanded attention, how effortlessly he made himself the center of every conversation he joined. When Jim arrived with his wife, Dad's energy shifted up another notch. Jim represented everything Dad admired: successful business, expensive tastes, connections that opened doors. They'd met at a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier and had been inseparable ever since, Dad adopting Jim's mannerisms and opinions with the enthusiasm of a teenager trying to impress the popular kids. I was standing near the bar when Dad approached with Jim in tow, his smile already forming the words I couldn't yet hear. The music was loud, the crowd thick around us, but somehow the space immediately surrounding our small group felt isolated, as if we were speaking in a bubble separate from the celebration around us. "Jim," Dad said, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when making introductions he considered important, "I'd like you to meet my daughter." He paused, and in that pause, I felt something shift. The smile on his face took on a different quality, not malicious exactly, but calculating. "This is the unemployed failure who never made something of herself." The words hit like cold water. Around us, conversation continued, but I felt suddenly separate from it all, watching the scene unfold from somewhere outside myself. A couple of relatives within earshot chuckled awkwardly, assuming this was Dad's attempt at self-deprecating humor about the challenges of raising children in difficult economic times. But I knew better. I could see it in his eyes, the satisfaction, the small cruelty of someone who believed he was putting me in my proper place. This wasn't a joke. This was his truth, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed his audience would share his assessment. Jim's reaction was immediate and unexpected. His casual smile faded as he looked at me more carefully, his eyes moving from my face to my uniform, taking in details he'd initially missed. The conversation around us continued, but Jim had gone completely still, his expression shifting from polite interest to something approaching shock. "Wait," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "You're the commander I read about in the defense briefings." The effect was instantaneous. The small group that had been half listening to Dad's introduction went completely silent. Eyes that had been politely averted suddenly focused with laser intensity. The awkward chuckling stopped. Even the ambient noise of the reception seemed to fade as people realized something significant was happening. Dad's face went through a series of changes: confusion, recognition, and finally a pale understanding of what had just occurred. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, my father was completely speechless. Jim continued staring at me, his businessman's mind clearly working to reconcile what he'd just heard with what he knew to be true. "I chair the Defense Advisory Committee for the Regional Chamber. We get briefings on major operations. I've seen your name on classified summaries." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications none of us had expected when the evening began. The immediate aftermath felt like watching a slow-motion explosion. Faces around our small circle registered confusion, then curiosity, then a dawning awareness that something significant had just been revealed. My cousin Mark, standing close enough to have heard everything, looked from Dad to me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between amazement and vindication. Dad's attempts to recover were painful to witness. He laughed, a sound that came out forced and hollow. "Well, Jim, you know how it is with government jobs. Hard to explain what they actually do." But his voice lacked its usual confidence, and the explanation felt desperate rather than dismissive. Jim wasn't letting it go. His businessman's instincts had kicked in, and he was processing information with the same intensity he'd bring to evaluating a major contract. "Commander," he said, and the title hung in the air like a challenge to everything Dad had just claimed. "The briefings mentioned operations in 3 different theaters. That's not typical government work." I could have stepped in then, could have deflected or minimized or found some way to smooth over the moment. Instead, I simply stood there, letting the truth speak for itself. Years of training had taught me the power of silence, the way uncomfortable truths gain strength when they're not immediately contradicted or explained away. "I do what needs to be done," I said finally, my voice steady and professional. It was perhaps the most diplomatic response I could manage, but it carried weight that Dad's dismissals couldn't match. The conversation around us had taken on a strange quality. People were talking, but everyone was also listening, trying to piece together what was happening without appearing to eavesdrop. Word was spreading through the invisible networks that exist at all family gatherings. I could see it in the way people glanced over, the way conversations paused and resumed with slightly different energy. My Aunt Patricia approached during a lull, her expression thoughtful. "Honey," she said, "I always wondered what you actually did. Your father never seemed to have details." There was something pointed in the way she said it, a subtle acknowledgement that his vague descriptions had never made sense to people who knew me. Later, as the reception wound down, my cousin Amy pulled me aside. We'd grown up together, shared countless family gatherings and childhood adventures. Her words came quietly but with unmistakable conviction. "I've been watching this for years," she said. "The way he talks about you, like you're some kind of disappointment. It never made sense. You were always the responsible one, the one who had her act together." She paused, glancing across the room to where Dad was making his goodbyes with noticeably less enthusiasm than he'd shown earlier. I'm glad someone finally called him on it. The validation was unexpected and powerful. I'd begun to wonder if I'd been imagining things, if my perception of his dismissiveness was colored by my own sensitivity or ambition. But Amy had seen it too, had been bothered by it, had recognized the disconnect between reality and Dad's narrative. Driving home that night, I replayed the moment over and over. Not the satisfaction of watching Dad's face go white, though I'd be lying if I said that hadn't felt good, but the strange relief of having the truth acknowledged by someone who mattered. Jim's recognition hadn't been political or personal. It was professional assessment from someone who understood the weight of the responsibilities I carried. For years, I'd allowed Dad's version of my story to go unchallenged, partly out of respect, partly out of exhaustion, and partly because I'd convinced myself his opinion didn't matter. But the wedding had revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged. It did matter, not because I needed his approval, but because his constant minimizing had created a distorted reality that affected how others saw me too. The phone calls started the next day. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly wanted to catch up, to hear more about my work, to understand what they'd witnessed at the reception. The conversations were awkward at first. Years of Dad's deflections had left most of them genuinely ignorant about my career, but they were also honest in ways our family interactions hadn't been for years. I realized I'd been complicit in maintaining the fiction, allowing Dad's need to diminish my achievements to go unchallenged for the sake of family peace. But peace built on lies isn't really peace at all. The foundation had cracked, and there was no going back. The phone rang on Thursday morning, 3 days after the wedding. Dad's voice came through with forced casualness, the tone he used when trying to pretend nothing significant had happened. "How was the drive back?" he asked, as if we were having a routine post-family event conversation. "Fine." I wasn't going to make this easy for him. A pause. "Listen, about Saturday night, Jim can be a little intense when he gets going. You know how these business types are, always trying to impress everyone with what they know." I almost admired the attempt. In his version, Jim was the problem, overeager, showing off, making a bigger deal of things than necessary. It was masterful deflection, the kind that had probably served him well in business negotiations. "Jim seemed pretty sure about what he'd read," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Well, you know how these government briefings are. Probably makes everything sound more important than it really is." There it was, the same dismissal, refined and repackaged, but fundamentally unchanged. Even after being publicly contradicted by someone with actual knowledge, Dad was still committed to minimizing my role, my responsibilities, my competence. "Dad," I said, and something in my voice must have warned him, because he went quiet. "I'm not going to pretend anymore. I'm not going to sit there while you introduce me as a failure to make yourself look like the successful father dealing with disappointing children. It stops now. You're overreacting." It was just no. The word came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying years of suppressed frustration. "It wasn't just anything. You meant what you said, and we both know it." The conversation that followed was difficult in ways I hadn't expected. Dad tried several approaches: guilt, minimization, redirection, but I'd finally reached the point where none of them worked. When he suggested I was embarrassing him in front of his peers, I pointed out that he'd embarrassed himself. When he claimed his introduction was just a joke, I reminded him that jokes are supposed to be funny. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be," he said finally. "No, Dad. You made it a big deal when you decided to publicly humiliate your daughter to score points with your business partner. I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't happen." The silence that followed felt different from the uncomfortable pauses earlier in the conversation. This was recognition, the sound of someone realizing their usual strategies weren't going to work. Within hours, other family members began reaching out. Some urged reconciliation, Others expressed support, but the most revealing conversation came from my Uncle Jeff, Dad's older brother. "He's been doing this for years," Jeff said bluntly, "taking credit for your good qualities and blaming you for anything that doesn't fit his image of the perfect patriarch. Your grandmother used to call him on it, but after she died, nobody wanted to make waves." The family dynamics I'd attributed to normal father-daughter tension were apparently more visible to others than I'd realized. What I'd experienced as personal disappointment was part of a larger pattern of behavior that extended beyond our relationship. "He needs you to be struggling," Jeff continued. "If you're successful without his guidance, what does that say about his importance as a father?" It was the clearest articulation of something I'd sensed, but never quite put into words. My success threatened his narrative of indispensability, so he'd simply chosen not to see it. The revelation was both liberating and sad. Liberating because it confirmed that the problem wasn't with my achievements or worthiness. Sad because it meant Dad's inability to acknowledge my success wasn't likely to change. It was too fundamental to his self-image. Over the following weeks, I made a conscious decision to stop accommodating his need to diminish me. When family conversations turned to career updates, I spoke honestly about my responsibilities. When relatives asked about my work, I answered directly instead of deflecting. When Dad tried to change the subject or minimize my contributions, I let the awkward silence stretch. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. People began approaching me differently at family gatherings, asking questions that reflected genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Conversations that had once centered around Dad's business ventures now included discussions of current events, international relations, and leadership challenges, topics where my perspective actually mattered. The most unexpected change was in how I felt about these interactions. For years, family gatherings had been exercises in careful navigation, avoiding topics that might highlight the disconnect between Dad's perception and reality. Now I could participate authentically, without constantly monitoring my words for anything that might challenge his narrative. Not everyone appreciated the change. A few relatives, particularly those who'd built their own relationships with Dad around shared business interests, seemed uncomfortable with the new dynamic. But their discomfort felt like confirmation rather than criticism, proof that the old arrangements had been as artificial as they'd felt. Dad's response was predictable. He doubled down on his version of events, telling anyone who'd listen that I was making a big deal out of nothing and trying to embarrass him over a simple misunderstanding. But his protests carried less weight now that people had seen the truth for themselves. The real change wasn't in his behavior. That remained largely consistent. The real change was in my willingness to accept it. 3 months after the wedding, I received orders for a new assignment that would require relocating across the country. As I prepared for the move, packing up years of accumulated belongings, I found myself thinking about cycles and patterns, about the ways families can trap each other in roles that no longer fit. Dad's inability to see my success hadn't diminished the success itself. His need to minimize my achievements hadn't made them less real. His discomfort with my competence didn't make me less competent. I'd spent years internalizing his assessment as if it were objective truth, but it was just one person's opinion, and not even a particularly well-informed one. The business partner who'd recognized my name at the wedding had done more than expose Dad's ignorance. He'd demonstrated that my work mattered to people who understood its significance, that my contributions had value in contexts Dad couldn't even imagine. It was validation I hadn't realized I needed until I received it. When I called to tell Dad about the assignment, his response was characteristically vague. "That's nice, kiddo. More government work." Something like that, I said, no longer bothering to correct or clarify. But this time, his dismissal felt different. Instead of frustration or disappointment, I felt something approaching pity. He'd built his identity around being the most important person in every room, the patriarch whose wisdom shaped his children's destinies. But his refusal to see who I'd become had left him talking to a version of me that existed only in his imagination. The tragedy wasn't that he'd failed to recognize my success. The tragedy was that his need to diminish me had cost him the chance to know me at all. He was so committed to his role as the father of a disappointment that he'd missed the opportunity to be proud of the daughter I'd actually become. As I finished packing, I realized the wedding moment had given me something I'd been seeking for years without knowing it: permission to stop seeking his approval. Not in dramatic confrontation or angry ultimatum, but in the quiet recognition that some people will never see you clearly, and their blindness says nothing about your worth. The business partner's recognition had been momentarily satisfying, but the lasting gift was simpler: the understanding that I didn't need Dad's version of my story to be true. Other people, people whose opinions mattered in contexts where my work actually counted, already knew who I was. The final irony was that Dad's attempt to humiliate me had accomplished exactly the opposite. In trying to make me small in front of someone he wanted to impress, he'd revealed the gap between his perception and reality. He'd meant to diminish me, but he diminished himself instead. Justice, it turned out, didn't require my participation at all. 2 years into my new assignment, I received news that Dad's business was struggling. The construction industry had shifted, new regulations had created compliance challenges, and several major contracts had fallen through. He'd reached out to relatives for advice, for connections, for the kind of help that had once flowed easily from his network. But something had changed in those relationships. The confidence that had once made him magnetic now seemed brittle, his certainty less convincing. People were polite but distant, offering sympathy without solutions. The business partner who'd recognized me at the wedding had quietly distanced himself, their friendship cooling after the revelation at the reception. I heard about Dad's struggles through family channels, concerned phone calls, worried conversations at holiday gatherings. Various relatives suggested I reach out, offer assistance, help bridge whatever gap had developed between us. The requests came wrapped in familiar language about family obligations and the importance of forgiveness. "He's proud," my aunt said during one of these conversations. "He won't ask for help directly, but I think he'd appreciate hearing from you." I considered it. My position had given me connections, resources, perspectives that might genuinely help someone navigating regulatory challenges and contract negotiations. Under different circumstances, I might have offered guidance or introductions that could make a meaningful difference. But pride, I'd learned, cuts both ways. During a brief leave, I attended my nephew's high school graduation. The family gathering was smaller than usual. Economic pressures had affected everyone's travel budgets, but the core group was there. Dad looked older than I remembered, his shoulders carrying a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical fatigue. When he saw me across the gymnasium, his expression shifted through several emotions before settling into careful neutrality. We spoke briefly, exchanging the kind of polite small talk that maintains social conventions without risking deeper engagement. "How's work going?" he asked, the question carrying none of its old dismissiveness, but also none of genuine curiosity. "Keeping busy," I replied, using his own deflection strategy. Later, during the family dinner, I watched him work to maintain his position as the family's central figure. The old confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of desperate joviality that made everyone slightly uncomfortable. He told stories that didn't quite land, made observations that felt forced, commanded attention that was given out of sympathy rather than genuine interest. My cousin Michael pulled me aside during dessert. "He's been different since the wedding," he said quietly. "Like, he can't figure out how to talk to people anymore." His whole approach used to work because everyone believed he was this successful guy who had it all figured out. But now, he didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone had seen the man behind the curtain, and the curtain couldn't be hung again. The most telling moment came when someone asked about my work. Instead of his usual deflection or minimization, Dad simply went quiet, letting me answer without interference. But there was no pride in his silence, no interest in what I had to say. It was the silence of someone who'd given up rather than someone who'd learned to listen. I realized then that I'd been waiting for something that was never going to come, not an apology exactly, but some acknowledgement of what had happened, some recognition of the years of dismissal and diminishment. But Dad's response to being proven wrong hadn't been reflection or growth. It had been withdrawal. He couldn't admit he'd misjudged me without admitting he'd built his identity on a foundation of false assumptions. The cost of acknowledging my success was too high because it would require him to fundamentally reconsider who he was as a father, as a man, as the architect of his family's narrative. So instead of growing, he'd simply stopped trying. Instead of learning to see me differently, he'd chosen to barely see me at all. The destruction felt complete, but not satisfying. I'd wanted recognition, but I'd gotten irrelevance. I'd wanted him to understand who I'd become, but I'd simply become invisible to him. The wedding moment hadn't changed his mind about me. It had broken his ability to maintain his illusions, leaving him with nothing to replace them. Flying back to my duty station, I found myself thinking about different kinds of victory. The dramatic confrontation I'd sometimes fantasized about would have been momentarily satisfying, but ultimately meaningless. Anger fades, arguments are forgotten, wounds can heal. But truth, once revealed, changes everything permanently. Dad hadn't learned to respect me, but he'd lost the ability to dismiss me. He hadn't gained insight into my worth, but he'd been stripped of his confidence in his own judgment. The change wasn't what I'd hoped for, but it was absolute in ways that apologies or recognition could never be. The business partner's words at the wedding, "You're the commander I read about in the defense briefings," had done more than embarrass Dad in front of someone he wanted to impress. They'd introduced an objective reality into a relationship built on subjective dismissal. Once that reality was acknowledged by someone whose opinion Dad valued, all his careful minimizations became obviously false. The victory wasn't in watching him struggle or seeing his confidence crumble. The victory was in the quiet recognition that his opinion of me had never been accurate, had never mattered as much as I'd believed, and no longer had the power to define my sense of worth. Sometimes the moment you stop needing someone's approval is the moment you realize you never really needed it at all. 5 years have passed since the wedding. I wear a different uniform now, carry different responsibilities, work in contexts Dad still couldn't begin to understand. The assignments have taken me across continents, through challenges that test every aspect of training and character. Each success builds on the last. Each promotion opens doors to greater responsibility and impact. The family dynamics have settled into new patterns. Dad's business eventually stabilized, though at a smaller scale than before. He's learned to navigate his reduced circumstances with the same careful attention to appearance that once characterized his prosperity. At family gatherings, he maintains his role as storyteller, but the stories are quieter now, less grandiose, more focused on nostalgia than conquest. We speak cordially when our paths cross at holidays and celebrations. He asks general questions about my government work, and I provide general answers. The conversations are polite, superficial, and entirely predictable. There's no hostility, but there's also no connection. We've become acquaintances who happen to share a history and some genetic material. The most revealing change is in how other family members relate to both of us. The wedding moment created a permanent shift in perception that extends far beyond our personal relationship. At my nephew's college graduation last month, relatives approached me with questions about international affairs, leadership challenges, and career advice. The conversations were substantive, engaged, and respectful in ways that would have been impossible when Dad's narrative about my life went unchallenged. He watched these interactions from across the room, his expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if he felt regret, resentment, or simple indifference. Perhaps he'd convinced himself that my connections were temporary, political, or unearned. Perhaps he'd found new ways to minimize what he couldn't control. Or perhaps he'd simply accepted that some stories have endings he didn't write. My Uncle Jeff, always the family's most direct communicator, mentioned Dad during a quiet moment at the reception. "He never figured out how to be proud of you," Jeff said. Too much threat to his image as the source of all wisdom in the family. Sad, really. He missed out on having an extraordinary daughter because he needed to be an important father. The observation carried weight because Jeff had known Dad longer than anyone, had watched him navigate decades of relationships and challenges. His assessment wasn't colored by disappointment or hope, just recognition of patterns that had played out over a lifetime. I've come to understand that the wedding wasn't a turning point so much as a revelation of something that had always been true. Dad's inability to see my achievements wasn't a failure of perception. It was a deliberate choice, a psychological necessity that protected his sense of importance. The business partner's recognition had simply made that choice visible to everyone else. The real transformation hadn't been in Dad's treatment of me, which remained essentially unchanged. The real transformation had been in my need for his treatment to be different. Somewhere in the aftermath of that public moment, I'd stopped waiting for him to understand who I'd become. I'd stopped measuring my worth against his recognition. I'd stopped believing that his approval was necessary for my success to be real. The work speaks for itself now. The colleagues who seek my input, the superiors who trust my judgment, the complex operations that depend on my decisions, they create a reality that exists entirely independent of Dad's opinions. In the contexts where my contributions actually matter, my value is recognized, respected, and relied upon. Last week, I received notification of another promotion, another increase in responsibility and scope. The recognition came with briefings that detailed the significance of the role, the trust being placed in my leadership, the impact my decisions would have on operations spanning multiple continents. The weight of it was both humbling and energizing, exactly the kind of challenge I'd trained my entire career to handle. I thought about calling Dad to share the news, but the impulse passed quickly. He wouldn't understand the significance, wouldn't be able to appreciate what the promotion represented in terms of trust, capability, and impact. His response would be some variation of "That's nice, kiddo," delivered with the same mild interest he'd show if I'd told him I'd rearranged my furniture. Instead, I called my grandmother, Dad's mother, now 92 and sharp as ever. She'd been watching our family dynamics for decades with the clear-eyed wisdom that comes from having raised difficult children and lived through enough disappointments to recognize them clearly. "I'm proud of you," she said after I'd explained the promotion. "Your grandfather would have been too. He understood what it meant to earn respect through competence rather than politics." We talked for an hour about leadership, responsibility, and the strange ways families can both shape and limit us. Near the end of the conversation, she made an observation that stayed with me long after we'd hung up. "Your father never learned the difference between being important and being impressive," she said. "You figured out how to be both, and that threatened everything he thought he knew about success." The insight felt like a final piece of a puzzle I'd been working on for years. Dad's need to diminish my achievements hadn't been about my inadequacy, it had been about his fear that my success would reveal his own limitations. Every promotion I earned, every responsibility I accepted, every time someone recognized my capabilities, it highlighted the gap between his version of importance and the real thing. At the wedding 5 years ago, when the business partner recognized my name from defense briefings, Dad had been forced to confront that gap in the most public way possible. His attempt to make me small had instead revealed how small his understanding of true achievement really was. The story has become part of family lore now, the moment when Dad's dismissive introduction backfired so spectacularly that it changed everyone's understanding of our relationship. People still bring it up at gatherings, usually with a mixture of amazement and secondhand embarrassment. It's become a cautionary tale about assumptions, about the dangers of defining other people's worth without bothering to understand their actual lives. But for me, the wedding was never really about Dad's embarrassment or the satisfaction of watching his confidence crumble. It was about the moment I stopped needing his story about my life to change. The moment I realized that his inability to see me clearly said nothing about my visibility to people who mattered in contexts where my work actually counted. The real victory wasn't in the dramatic revelation or the public embarrassment. The real victory was in the quiet recognition that followed, the understanding that I'd been giving too much power to someone whose opinion was both uninformed and irrelevant to my actual success. Sometimes justice doesn't come from confrontation or revenge. Sometimes it comes from the simple recognition that the person whose approval you've been seeking was never qualified to judge you in the first place. Sometimes the moment you stop apologizing for your existence is the moment the world finally sees you and you finally see yourself clearly. The business partner's words at the wedding had been a gift, but not the one I'd initially thought. He hadn't given me validation or recognition or proof of my worth. He'd given me permission to stop seeking those things from someone who was never going to provide them. 5 years later, I understand that Dad's inability to acknowledge my achievements was never about my achievements at all. It was about his need to remain the central figure in every narrative, the source of all wisdom and success in our family. My competence threatened that role, so he'd chosen not to see it. But you can only ignore reality for so long before it finds a way to make itself known. The wedding was just the moment when reality and perception collided in front of an audience that mattered to him more than I did. The story continues now without him as a central character. I advance, lead, contribute, and succeed in contexts he doesn't understand and probably never will. The recognition comes from peers, superiors, and colleagues who judge competence by results rather than politics. The satisfaction comes from work that matters, challenges that test every aspect of training and character, and the knowledge that trust earned through performance is the most reliable foundation for any career. Dad remains in his own story, playing the role of successful patriarch to an audience that's learned to see through the performance. We coexist in family spaces, maintaining the polite fiction that our relationship is normal rather than non-existent. It's not hostile or dramatic, just empty, like a conversation between strangers who happen to know each other's names. The emptiness doesn't hurt anymore. It's simply what it is, the natural result of one person's refusal to see another clearly, and the other person's decision to stop trying to be seen by someone whose vision was always distorted by his own needs. Sometimes the greatest victory is realizing you don't need to win at all. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after my latest promotion. Mom's voice carried that careful neutrality she used when delivering news she knew would complicate my life. "Your father's in the hospital," she said without preamble. "Heart attack. They say he's stable, but it was close." I was in my office, reviewing operational reports, when the words registered. Through my window, I could see the parade ground where morning formations were conducting their daily routines. The normalcy of the scene felt jarring against the sudden shift in my personal landscape. "How bad?" I asked. "Bad enough that they're talking about surgery. Triple bypass, maybe more." Mom's voice caught slightly. "He's asking for you." The last part surprised me more than the medical details. In the 5 years since the wedding, our conversations had been limited to polite exchanges at family gatherings. The idea that he would specifically request my presence seemed out of character for the careful distance we'd maintained. "I can get emergency leave," I said, already running through the logistics. "I'll be there tomorrow." The flight home gave me 12 hours to process the situation. Heart attacks have a way of putting things into perspective, forcing confrontations with mortality that can't be deflected or minimized. Whatever issues existed between Dad and me, the possibility of his death created a deadline for resolution that hadn't existed before. But I also recognized the danger in that thinking. Crisis doesn't automatically create wisdom or change fundamental character traits. The man lying in the cardiac unit was the same person who'd introduced me as an unemployed failure. Medical emergency didn't erase years of dismissal and diminishment. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and industrial coffee. Dad looked smaller in the bed than I'd expected, connected to machines that beeped and whirred with mechanical precision. His face had a grayish tinge that spoke to the seriousness of his condition, but his eyes were alert and focused when I entered the room. "You came," he said, and there was something in his voice I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, maybe? Or relief. "Mom said you asked for me." He nodded, then looked away toward the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through Venetian blinds. "The doctors say I might not make it through surgery. They have to do something about these arteries, but there are no guarantees." The conversation felt surreal, not because of his medical situation, but because we were talking directly about something that mattered. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing or deflecting or trying to control the narrative. He was just a man facing mortality and trying to figure out what needed to be said. "The surgery has good success rates," I offered, falling back on objective information when emotion felt too complicated. "Maybe?" He turned back to look at me, and his expression carried a weight I'd never seen before. "I've been thinking about things. About what I've done wrong as a father." The admission hung in the air between us, unexpected and fragile. I waited, unsure how to respond to this version of Dad, direct, vulnerable, stripped of his usual confidence. "That night at Jennifer's wedding," he continued, "when Jim recognized you, I knew then that I'd made a mistake. Not just that night, but for years. I'd been so busy trying to stay important that I couldn't see what was actually important. The words were the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him, but they came wrapped in the kind of self-focus that had always characterized his worldview. Even his regret centered on his own experience, his own recognition, his own mistake. Why did it matter more when Jim said it? I asked. Why couldn't you just believe me when I told you about my work? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with something he'd probably never examined directly. Because Jim was successful, he said finally. Because his opinion carried weight in my world. Because if he respected you, it meant you were worth respecting. The honesty was brutal and revealing. Dad had needed external validation of my worth before he could acknowledge it himself. His assessment of my value had always been filtered through other people's reactions, other people's recognition, other people's approval. I'd never been real to him as an independent person, only as a reflection of how I made him look. That's not how fathers are supposed to work, I said quietly. No, he agreed. It's not. We talked for another hour, the conversation meandering through topics we'd never addressed directly. He asked about my work with genuine curiosity for the first time, listening to my explanations without trying to minimize or redirect. He acknowledged the financial help I'd provided over the years, the family emergencies I'd handled, the ways I'd supported the family without recognition or thanks. But even as he spoke, I could sense the limitations of this moment. His newfound awareness was real, but it was also crisis-driven, prompted by the possibility of death rather than any fundamental change in character. The man having this conversation with me was the same person who'd spent years diminishing my achievements. He was just scared enough to temporarily set aside his usual patterns. When visiting hours ended, I drove to my childhood home and sat in the driveway, processing what had just happened. The conversation had been more honest than anything we'd shared in decades, but it had also confirmed something I'd suspected. Dad's inability to see me clearly hadn't been accidental or unconscious. It had been deliberate, a conscious choice to prioritize his own ego over my reality. The surgery went well. Dad spent 6 days in recovery, during which our conversations continued in the same vein, direct, sometimes difficult, but more genuine than our relationship had been since I was a child. He asked about my colleagues, my responsibilities, the decisions I faced in my role. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in understanding my life rather than dismissing it. But I also noticed the pattern in his questions. He was most engaged when I described interactions with high-ranking officials, major operations, moments where my work intersected with the kind of power and recognition he understood. He struggled to maintain interest when I talked about the day-to-day leadership challenges, the human aspects of command, the parts of my job that required emotional intelligence rather than strategic thinking. Even in this new, more honest version of our relationship, he could only see the parts of me that reflected his own values and interests. The recognition was real, but it was still filtered through his lens of what mattered, what counted, what deserved attention. 2 weeks after the surgery, as he prepared to go home, Dad made an unexpected request. He wanted to host a family dinner, he said, to thank everyone who'd supported him through the medical crisis. But he also wanted to do something he'd never done before, acknowledge my career publicly, in front of the extended family. I want to make up for that wedding, he said. I want people to understand who you really are. The offer was well-intentioned, but it missed the point entirely. The problem had never been that people didn't understand my work, it was that he'd actively prevented them from understanding it. The wedding moment hadn't been an isolated mistake, it had been the culmination of years of deliberate dismissal and minimization. More importantly, I no longer needed his acknowledgement to feel validated. The recognition I'd found in my professional life, the respect I'd earned from colleagues and superiors, the satisfaction I derived from meaningful work, none of it depended on his approval or understanding. I appreciate the thought, I told him, but that's not necessary. What matters is that we understand each other now. He looked confused, as if he couldn't comprehend why I wouldn't want the public recognition he was offering. In his mind, the gesture would repair everything, would undo years of damage through a single moment of acknowledgement. But public redemption wasn't what I needed from him anymore. What I needed was what we'd already achieved in those hospital conversations: honesty about what had happened, recognition of the impact it had had, and a commitment to something different going forward. The family dinner he was proposing would be performance, another moment where he positioned himself as the benevolent patriarch bestowing recognition on his deserving daughter. I'd learned to value substance over theater, and our private conversations had provided the substance I'd been seeking without knowing it. The recovery period stretched into months. Dad's business suffered during his absence, and he began talking about retirement, about scaling back, about letting younger people take over the day-to-day operations. The near-death experience had shifted his priorities in ways that seemed genuine and lasting. But it had also revealed something about the nature of change and forgiveness that I hadn't fully understood before. Dad's newfound ability to see and acknowledge my achievements was real, but it coexisted with the same fundamental character traits that had created the problem in the first place. He was still primarily concerned with how things looked, still measured worth through external validation, still needed to be the central figure in family narratives. The difference was that his brush with mortality had temporarily expanded his definition of what deserved recognition. My work had finally crossed the threshold of importance in his mind, not because he'd learned to value different things, but because circumstances had forced him to acknowledge the significance of what I'd been doing all along. It was progress, but it was limited progress, constrained by the same worldview that had created the original problem. Dad had learned to respect my achievements, but he learned it for the wrong reasons, through the wrong process, at the wrong time. The realization was both disappointing and liberating. Disappointing because it confirmed that genuine understanding remained elusive, that, even in crisis, his perception was filtered through his own needs and limitations. Liberating because it freed me from the expectation that he would ever see me completely clearly. The relationship we built during his recovery was better than what we'd had before, but it was also honest about its limitations. We could talk about my work now, could acknowledge my contributions to the family, could interact without the constant undercurrent of dismissal that had characterized our previous dynamic. But the recognition came wrapped in conditions and qualifications that revealed how tentative and circumstantial his respect really was. 6 months after the surgery, Dad returned to work part-time. The business had struggled in his absence, and he faced decisions about downsizing, restructuring, and adapting to a market that had continued evolving while he was focused on recovery. For the first time in our adult relationship, he asked for my advice, not about military matters, but about leadership, about managing organizational change, about maintaining team cohesion during difficult transitions. The conversations were professional and productive. I could offer perspectives drawn from my experience with complex operations, multi-layered challenges, and high-stakes decision-making. Dad listened carefully, asked follow-up questions, and implemented several of my suggestions. The dynamic felt entirely different from our previous interactions, collaborative rather than dismissive, respectful rather than condescending. But I also recognized that his willingness to seek my input was driven by necessity rather than choice. His business was struggling, his usual advisors had proven inadequate to the challenges he faced, and my expertise happened to be relevant to his current situation. He valued my advice because he needed it, not because he developed a general appreciation for my judgment or capabilities. The distinction mattered because it revealed the conditional nature of his respect. When my expertise served his purposes, he was eager to engage with it. When it didn't directly benefit him, he remained largely indifferent. The change was real, but it was also instrumental, a practical adjustment rather than a fundamental shift in how he saw me as a person. Understanding that limitation allowed me to appreciate the progress we'd made without expecting more than was realistic. We'd found a way to interact that acknowledged my competence and his needs without requiring either of us to pretend the relationship was something it had never been. It was functional, respectful, and honest about its boundaries, more than we'd managed for most of my adult life. The wedding moment, 5 years earlier, had been the catalyst for this evolution, but it hadn't been the resolution. The real resolution came in accepting that some changes happen slowly and imperfectly, that recognition can be genuine without being complete, and that respect earned through crisis is still respect worth having. The test came 18 months later, at another family wedding, my younger cousin Amanda's marriage to a doctor she'd met during residency. The venue was different, the crowd smaller, but the dynamics felt familiar. Extended family gathered from across several states, business associates mingled with relatives, and the usual mixture of celebration and social positioning played out over cocktails and dinner. Dad's recovery had been complete by then. His business had stabilized at a smaller but more sustainable scale, and he developed a new appreciation for work-life balance that would have been impossible before his heart attack. But I watched him move through the reception crowd with interest, curious to see how he would handle introductions now that our relationship had evolved. The moment came when Jim, the same business partner who'd recognized me at Jennifer's wedding years earlier, approached with a colleague I'd never met. The symmetry felt deliberate, as if the universe was providing an opportunity to measure how much had actually changed. "Jim," Dad said, his voice carrying genuine warmth, "good to see you. Have you met my daughter?" The pause that followed was subtle but significant. I could see Dad considering his words, weighing options, perhaps remembering that other introduction and its consequences. When he continued, his voice was steady but careful. "She's a commander in the military. Just got promoted to a position I can't even pronounce correctly." It wasn't eloquent, but it was accurate. More importantly, it was respectful. Jim smiled and shook my hand, making polite conversation about my work before the group moved on to other topics. The interaction was unremarkable in every way except one. It represented a complete reversal of Dad's previous approach to these situations. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Dad found me on the hotel terrace where I'd stepped out for some air. The night was clear, stars visible despite the ambient light from the city below. "I handled that better this time," he said without preamble. "You did." Jim's colleague seemed impressed. "Asked me afterward about your career, what kind of responsibilities you have." Dad paused, looking out at the city lights. "I had to admit I still don't understand most of what you do. But I told him you're good at it, that people trust you with important decisions." The conversation felt different from our hospital talks, less crisis-driven, more reflective. Dad had had time to process the changes in our relationship, to understand them as permanent rather than temporary adjustments to emergency circumstances. "The thing I keep thinking about," he continued, "is how many people I probably told the wrong story to over the years. How many times I made you sound like someone you weren't." I'd thought about that too, the ripple effects of his dismissiveness, the ways his version of my life had shaped other people's perceptions. But dwelling on it felt unproductive, like accounting for damage that couldn't be undone. "People figure things out eventually," I said. "The ones who matter, anyway." "Maybe. But I should have made it easier. Should have been proud instead of." He searched for the right word. "Instead of whatever I was being." "Threatened," I supplied. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, threatened. That's exactly what it was." The admission came easier now than it would have years earlier. Dad's brush with mortality had given him permission to examine his motivations more honestly, to acknowledge feelings he'd previously buried under layers of rationalization and denial. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching traffic move through the streets below. The conversation didn't need to go deeper, we'd already covered the essential territory in previous talks. This was just confirmation that the changes were holding, that they extended beyond crisis-driven moments into ordinary family interactions. "I'm proud of you now," Dad said eventually. "I know that probably doesn't carry as much weight as it would have when you were younger, but I wanted you to know." He was right that the words didn't carry the same impact they might have had a decade earlier. I'd found other sources of validation, built my identity around achievements and relationships that existed independently of his approval. But they weren't meaningless either. They represented a kind of completion, a closing of a loop that had been left open for too long. "It matters," I said simply. The wedding reception became a kind of template for our interactions going forward. Dad had learned to introduce me accurately, to speak about my career with respect if not full understanding, to acknowledge my contributions without trying to take credit for them. The changes weren't dramatic. They were small, consistent adjustments that accumulated over time into something that felt genuinely different. More importantly, I'd learned to appreciate those changes without expecting perfection. Dad would probably always measure success through external recognition, would always be more impressed by titles and official acknowledgments than by quiet competence. But he'd also learned to recognize that my work generated exactly those kinds of external markers, that my achievements registered on the scales he understood. The relationship we'd built wasn't the one I'd wanted as a child: unconditional support, enthusiastic encouragement, pride in my efforts regardless of their public recognition. But it was honest about who we both were, realistic about our limitations, and functional in ways that served both our needs. The wedding moment that had started this evolution remained a family story, told and retold with the kind of relish reserved for moments when justice feels particularly poetic. But for me, the real story was quieter and longer, the slow work of rebuilding trust, setting boundaries, and finding ways to connect across fundamental differences in worldview. Some victories are dramatic and satisfying. Others are patient and incomplete. The second kind, I'd learned, often prove more durable than the first. That was my story. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been put down by someone who is supposed to lift you up? Did you ever get that moment where the truth finally came out? Drop your experience in the comments below. And if you're ready for more true stories about family, respect, and standing your ground, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.